Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Emily, and I am a volunteer for UK Youth for Nature. We are a network of 16 to 35-year-olds from across the UK calling on the government to take action on the nature crisis. We specialise in creative campaigns that work to facilitate positive conversations between young people and decision makers. In today's webinar, we will be exploring the topic of eco-anxiety. And eco-anxiety is not the only emotion that people will feel or do feel when talking about the climate crisis. And this is something that's important to be aware of, but today we'll be focusing on that. And before I let the speakers introduce themselves, I thought I'd just share a fact about eco-anxiety, that in a global survey in 2021, it was found that more than half of people aged 16 to 25 felt sad, anxious, or powerless, or had other negative emotions about climate change. So this is a very important topic. So if the speakers are happy to, I'm going to give them just a little bit of time to introduce themselves quickly. If we could start with Ellie, and then we'll go to Morag and Parker.
Hello. So just to echo what Emily said in the beginning, just a big thank you for being here with us. It's my first proper time on a panel, so that's quite exciting. Have I said my name? Yeah. I'm a community cultivator at Reaction Collective. So Reaction is a global community united by our love for the planet and adventure. We're on a bit of a mission to reshape the outdoor industry. That's the outdoor sports industry from the ground up through partnerships worldwide. We're pioneering sustainable practices like repair, repurpose, and rental, making outdoor activities more inclusive and accessible. My happy place is by the sea with my dogs. So yeah, that's me.
Lovely, thank you, Ellie.
No
Morag?
I'm Morag. I'm currently a student and I'm really into volunteering, particularly in wildlife conservation and social change. And from my experiences of eco-anxiety and other climate emotions, I aim to make resources and workshops to help support people with this. And it's also my first panel. And I guess borrowing from Ellie, happy place would be being outside in the woods or by the sea.
Thank you so much, Morag. And Parker?
Yes, thank you all. It's lovely to be with you all. I'm Parker. I work as a climate aware psychotherapist and mindfulness teacher. Also similar to what Morag and Ellie share, very passionate about working at the intersection of mental health, climate justice, and I also work with engaged spirituality. And my happy place, I enjoy lying in the sun like an iguana, where it's not very important. So yeah, that's me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. So now we're going to start off with some of the the panel questions. So I thought we could first just sort of talk about how each of you maybe experience eco-anxiety and how you currently manage it. Ellie, if you're happy to go first again.
Yeah, of course. I guess for me, being neurodivergent, I've always felt that I experience life on a different frequency, sometimes deeper and more intensely than other people, and that sensitivity translates to my experience of eco-anxiety as well. And it's not just the big global issues that weigh on my shoulders, but also the everyday actions that I feel connected to a larger picture. And I think I've always felt that sort of burden when people say your generation will save us. That's a sentiment that I know is sort of a vote of confidence in our generation, but it comes across quite differently. But for me, there's something really calming and grounding in being outside. It's where I feel most at home. And eco-anxiety has taught me about the importance of balance between concern and action and feeling and doing. And I think sometimes stepping away and into nature is exactly what I need to do to find that.
Perfect. Thank you, Ellie. Morag?
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I'd kind of echo that experience of having the importance of being outdoors that Ellie was talking about. And for me, eco-anxiety is part of like quite a wider experience. of despair and panic and fear. And for me, that encompasses everything. They're both social and ecological and all those interdependent issues in the world. And for me, my experiences tend to go a lot between oscillating between this kind of panic and despair that no one's doing enough, and there's this pressure on myself therefore to do everything, and a constant sense of this inability to make a difference, and like lots of people, often how I've managed that is just trying to do more and more, and it often severely impacted my mental and physical health. And I went from a very anxious place to actually a time when I felt I was very shut down and basically really struggled to function and focus on anything that wasn't about addressing these problems. Focusing on anything of myself just felt so pointless and irrelevant. I really struggled with my self-care and became very isolated. So I think finding community has been incredibly important. And I experience eco-anxiety quite physically as well. So there have been times where I'm kind of unable to feel, like physically numb, unable to feel like my arms and hands. And yeah, just this sense of isolation. So finding community has been actually really powerful in feeling able to do something and actually be held by that community. It's not all on you. Yes, it is you. Yes, we do need to do things now, but it's actually, you can be held in that community. It's okay to pause and step back because there are other people doing amazing work too. So, and also learning that it's something of a dynamic equilibrium. These things oscillate, these feelings oscillate and change. And I think sometimes we actually need to lean into feeling. Because I think often we end up pushing it away or ignoring things. So sometimes we need to really feel that pain and grief in order to actually move through it and validate that for ourselves. And being with others, or just kind of taking that time for yourself, has been really, really valuable for me.
Thank you, Morag. That was great. And I'm so sorry to hear that you've experienced that, but I'm sure a lot of people will resonate with it. And you've already given some ways that people can try and cope with their feelings of eco-anxiety. Parker, if you're happy to talk a little bit about your experience of it.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with what Ellie and Morag shared. Maybe something I could share that is slightly different is I think I'm on the just put it the older side of the youth category. And so eco anxiety has been something that I feel like I'm maybe part of like the last like generation or the end of is like a kind of younger-ish millennial, where I grew up with this ignorance is bliss kind of thing. And it really wasn't until my like mid-20s when I became like climate aware. And so I felt like my life was taking one trajectory that was very kind of business as usual. And I literally didn't think outside of that. And the 2016 elections in the US, just where I'm from, if my accent isn't clear, that kind of aligned for me with becoming aware of the climate crisis and also like in discovering like an engaged Buddhist practice, which I think might share more about later. But all of these things have kind of shifted. It feels like there's like a before I became aware of the climate crisis and an after. And I've tried so many things, I think, to cope with it. And at the moment, with everything unfolding from Gaza to the hurricanes in the US, I'm definitely in a moment of grief. And it's something that I've been working a lot to try to be like more okay with the grief and not needing to like focus on being hopeful or trying to take all of this action at the moment. I think my action is non-action in these days of just really being with what's already been lost and trying to have some acceptance of that amidst the despair.
Thank you, Parker. I think that's really important to touch upon the different emotions that we might be feeling, and that sometimes we can't take action in that very moment, that you have to sit with those emotions. You've all sort of all three of you have touched upon this a little bit, but if there was anything else you wanted to perhaps add on, are there any sort of other life experiences or perhaps things that you identify as or with that have affected your experiences of eco-anxiety now or in the past? Just be interesting to hear about that. Ellie, if you're happy to go again. You're muted. Don't worry, it happens.
Am I good? Am I good?
Yeah, you're good. We can hear you now.
Woo!
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay. Yeah, like I said, being neurodivergent, I think I process it in a more intense, layered way. That's not to invalidate anyone else's emotions, but that's certainly what I've experienced. I don't think I witness the problems. I think I feel them a lot more deeply. When it comes to environmental issues, it can get really overwhelming really quickly because I feel really connected to everything that's happening, especially biodiversity loss. That's something that I really struggle with as well. On the flip side, I think it's also my strength. Like that intensity drives me to sort of seek out solutions and participate. I mean, solutions is quite definitive and it's not a great way to describe it, but I think there is a part to play in that. I think it's also about turning that anxiety into action, and there is no normal way to feel or process it. For me, certainly it's a deep visceral connection to nature, which has helped me seek like solace in nature and the collective work that we do with reaction, and it's kind of helped me find my crew a little bit, and that's been really great for me.
Amazing. Thank you, Ellie, for sharing. Morag?
Yeah, I mean, kind of similarly to Ellie, how I experience things, my brain just doesn't switch off. I can't pretend it's not there. People might say, oh, just stop reading the news, or you're being too sensitive. And my brain, it just doesn't work that way. You can't choose to ignore something. And also how I kind of see the world, everything being really interconnected. Every choice and decision has hundreds of things feeding in and out of it. Like you're constantly following loads and loads of different trajectories. And it can make it really overwhelming, similarly to how Ellie was talking about. And I'm sure lots of people experience that kind of sense of overwhelm. I also find kind of social interaction quite difficult, which has made it hard, I think, to find that sense of community or build relationships. And probably this is, again, maybe something people share, is that difficulty connecting when you feel like people just don't seem to understand or don't seem to take it seriously enough. And I think, like I said, I experience it quite physically, partly, again, just based on how my brain works. So I also get quite sensory overwhelm. But yeah, I suppose that's been my experiences. And growing up in London and seeing those incredible inequalities and disparities, and actually how they interconnect into issues of race, of gender, of where you live, of how that impacts the air quality and like health and access to nature. That's, I suppose, been something that's part of my life and that I've been aware of for a very long time.
Thank you, Morag, for sharing. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that later. And Parker, if you had anything to add to that question.
Yeah. I mean, similar to everything Ellie and Morag shared resonates a lot. Some of the effect of lens that I've experienced eco-anxiety through a lot of is I've been a gardener, like organic vegetable farmer for maybe the past 67 years. And so it feels like there's this dual awareness where I feel very connected with the natural abundance of growing food in the way of just like having a bumper harvest of winter squash or tomatoes. And I feel like there's this resilience of the earth and of nature that I feel it's very visceral because it also sustains me and the people we're growing food for. And at the same time, I feel like being a farmer, and for example, last year I was working in France and we had one of the wettest seasons that they had in like 40 years. And just realizing the abundance that nature offers, that it's also so fragile and dependent on a stable climate, and how easily these things can break down, and how much too much rain might be a nuisance. If I live in a city, it's like, oh, it's raining again, but that's food that's rotting in the ground, and the money that's being lost by farmers, and food that has to come from elsewhere that might have a longer distance to go. I mean, like there's so many things. So it influences how I feel, both abundance and also a real sense of fragility and gratitude for stability in these things.
Thank you, Parker, again for sharing. You've all made really important points, and it's just, I think, really important to hear everyone's experiences, because they are very different, but you can also find interconnections and similarities between each other as well. Parker mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you do obviously hope and optimism. You can't always feel hopeful and optimistic, but what role do you think hope or optimism play in addressing eco-anxiety, especially in the face of a very overwhelming environmental challenges, but also this climate crisis? Ellie, if you're okay to go.
Big question. I've always been a little bit resistant to using words like hope and optimism because they can feel a little bit hollow or even a little bit toxic. But I think as if hoping for the best, it will somehow like solve the crisis that we're in. It feels a bit fatalistic. But what I do believe in is rebellious hope, and the idea that hope isn't passive but an active process, and it's something that you're fighting for. And stubborn optimism is the kind that persists even when the odds are stacked against you, and it's about holding on to that fire inside of you to keep going even when things feel tough. And I think for me it's less about sitting back and hoping things will get better, and getting more involved and doing the work and participating and believing that we can create change, especially if we come together.
Thank you, Ellie. I loved how you talked about hope in that, and also how you described them. I think it's really, really special as well. Morag, you'd like to say something?
Yeah, Ellie, your answers so much resonates with me. That they like, it's not about like wishful thinking or pretending or hoping that everything's going to be fine, but actually getting up and doing something with that intention. And I think it's so important to have some kind of belief and vision that something can change, rather than, it doesn't have to be about feeling hopeful, but it's or about like the extent of maybe weighing up what's good and what's bad happening in the world, but actually that these small moments of wonder and beauty and resilience, like Parker was talking about, to really appreciate those and wonder that, wow, this exists at all, and it's still growing. So it's not really the weighting of the two, but the fact that these things exist at all. And it's so much more. You can't build a movement from despair alone if you just focus on all the pain and the suffering. You have to have some sense of something to change to. And it's much more sustainable and effective and empowering to act from what you love and hope and connection than just from despair. And I think that the two are not they're not exclusive to each other. You can have both at the same time.
Thank you, Morag. I loved Ellie's use of rebellious hope, and I love your use of wonder, and looking at the wonder in the world as is also very, very important around us. Parker?
Yeah, yeah, I definitely feel all of those resistances that you all shared. A friend recently, we were talking about hope, and she was like, like the H word. And that really resonated with me, where it's this like elephant in the room. And I really feel, especially working as a mental health professional, this pressure to have hope and to give people hope. And, with eco anxiety, people come in and there's this pressure, not from individuals maybe, but collectively, where it's like, oh, we need to instill hope and take action, and we have to be optimistic. And I can really struggle with that, because if it doesn't feel like it's matching my reality, like what I'm aware of, like having hope, like Ellie said, feels a bit hollow, maybe. Um, Something I've been reflecting on recently, I was at a mindfulness retreat last year, and one of the monastics was sharing about how in mindfulness, like, to be mindful, you have to be mindful of something. Like, there has to be an object to it. Like, you're mindful of your breath or of your steps. And something that came up for me was, I feel like maybe it's similar for hope, that hope for me has to have an object, that is not just like I'm hopeful or I'm not hopeful. Like, what am I hopeful for, or what do I have hope in? So that's been a way I've been trying to like break it down a bit more. And it's like, yes, maybe I don't have like hope that the fossil fuel companies are going to stop destroying the planet on their own. I don't have hope for that, but I do have hope, like I was sharing, in the resilience of the natural world, or I do have hope in like the compassion of like people I meet organizing, and like people putting their literal lives on the line for the earth and for climate justice. And so, yeah, breaking it down has been something I've tried to do more and more.
Thank you, Parker. That's a really important reflection to make on the use of the term hope and how it's used, and maybe like looking at it in a slightly different way. And also the idea of compassion, I think, is really, really important. We're going to now go on to more specific questions for each speaker. So we're going to start off with Ellie. And the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was, before the webinar, when we were having a conversation, you spoke about how you struggled with eco-anxiety in school. I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit, or tell us all, maybe where this came from and how it then impacted you. And I perhaps thought maybe you could just, if there was a way that teachers could have talked about the climate crisis differently. That is quite a big question, so it's okay. But yeah, that sort of thing, your experience with it in school.
Yeah. To be honest, I've just found school really difficult. I think, again, like being neurodivergent and feeling like I was just trapped in a box all the time, when really all I wanted to do is just sort of get out of there as soon as possible. And it was the pressure of exams that I struggled with more than anything. And I mean, like, the anxiety didn't help, but yeah, being in the confines of a classroom was something that I just really struggled with. But yeah, in terms of feeling like climate anxiety on a deeper level, I'm not really sure where that started, but I know it became a lot more real when I first heard Greta speak. It kind of felt like a switch flipped in me, and I didn't realise that I could do something at that point. But I always sort of thought that you had to be like the loudest and the most bold person to make an impact, and eco-anxiety became less about the helplessness of it all and more about finding my role in the larger movement. And what I've come to realize is it's not about saving the world on your own. I think that, for me, that was a classic neurodivergent thing. That was like, yeah, I've got to sort this out on my own. But no, it's about finding where your voice fits and contributing in whatever way you can.
Thank you, Ellie. I think you've answered that question very well, because it's really difficult to talk about something so personal, but the fact that you've sort of spoken about how you can find your own way of working within the climate crisis and working with others, that you aren't alone, even if you might feel like you are. And there are ways of not always having to be the loudest in the room to be able to connect with others and actually feel as though you're making a difference, or at least trying to. So yeah, thank you for that. And then you're also currently a community cultivator for Reaction Collective. And I thought it'd be good to just hear a little bit more about what Reaction do and how your work as a community cultivator has maybe inspired you and how it's made you feel more hopeful. I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. I think Reaction as a whole has completely shifted my perspective on things. Like, there are so many beautiful souls in that collective, and I've definitely found my crew. I think the work that we do together, whether it's pioneering sustainable practice or just holding space for one another, or even like cultivating community, it reminds me that change is infinitely possible, and even in the face of big challenges, seeing how people come together and sharing that love for the planet and outdoor adventures makes me feel really hopeful. And I don't see myself as a hopeful person, like I said, and in the traditional sense, but Reaction has taught me that collective action works. Like, there are so many different ways of showing up for the planet, and whatever you do has a role to play. And it's inspiring to be part of something that brings people together for a shared purpose. And I'm reminded that it's not about talking about change. No, sorry, we're not just talking about creating change, like, we're actually doing it. And that fuels me more than anything else, because it's not really about what we do as individuals, it's the magic that happens when we all come together.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ellie.
Oh,
definitely everyone check out Reaction. I'm definitely going to be doing that after this.
Oh, thanks, Emily.
Morag, so I'm going to move on to your questions, some of the questions that we have prepared. The first one was the importance of the interconnection or the intersection of the ecological and the social when talking about the climate crisis, but also eco-anxiety. I was wondering if you could explain this a little bit more and why you think it's important.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say for me, well, you can't really separate them. I think people can talk about addressing social issues or addressing ecological issues and just treating them as separate spheres, but what affects wildlife and the environment affects people, and social injustices and issues really affect how the climate impacts people. And I think we're probably all aware of the incredible injustices in how the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis impact certain communities way more than others, frequently those who've really contributed least. And they're the same people who are being mistreated and oppressed and dealing with the worst of the systems that we already have. And, we can't talk about deforestation in the Amazon, ecological exploitation, oil spills in the Niger Delta without thinking about and talking about the impacts on the people and the communities who live there, where it's their way of life and heritage and history. And we can't ignore, the role of exploitive corporations and their targeting of deprived areas, like building these waste plants and the impacts on people's health in specifically targeting, lower income areas. And we also can't ignore how the kind of global economic power structures, historical oppression and discrimination really drive so much of this damage, both social and ecological. And well, I kind of really can't say social and ecological, socio-ecological. I'm not sure how the best way to talk about it is. But how this just perpetuates that injustice at local and global scales. And I think, we really see this in so much of the response to and effects of climate change and ecological harms. And we also see it in how things like refugee crises, where people, they're forced to move, and that really impacts, people's health, people's well-being. And, it's so much integrated with each other that, we can't really separate them. All this flooding, rising sea levels, drought, and climate-induced famines, these impact people's lives. It's not just just nature, and it's not. And the thing is that it's also goes in the opposite direction. We need to make sure that the solutions we come up with aren't then negatively impacting the world. And I think just as these issues are connected, it means that there's such an opportunity for connecting solutions. And like Ellie said, that's kind of weird word to use, solutions, but to address both of these and tackle both of them, and bring these things together, like community gardens providing spaces for people to enjoy, as well as cleaning the air, as well as providing cooling and climate impacts, like micro energy schemes and providing electricity, which then powers health clinics, schools, enterprises that empower women and disadvantaged groups, as well as reducing reliance on fossil fuels. I think there's so much power in connecting solutions across social and ecological. So I think it's important to appreciate that they're not separate and they're incredibly interconnected. And well, I can't really say social and ecological. It's all one big thing, and that can seem really overwhelming. But I think we need to focus on actually how much of an opportunity that is.
Definitely. Thank you, Morag. I think that's a really important to make when talking about the climate crisis. It's a climate justice issue, both the environmental and the like the social side of things as well. Sorry, we just have someone. Just make sure that you're muted, please, if possible, because I think someone. There we go. Okay. Sorry. You wanted to also mention something more, like a little bit about privilege, maybe, when talking about like eco-anxiety, and then we can move on to Parker's questions.
Yeah, in terms of thinking about power and privilege, I think I've talked about, and I'm sure we're all aware of those injustices, how they disproportionately impact communities who've contributed least, and all interconnected with poverty, health, racism, sexism, human rights abuses. And these social economic systems are the same ones that exacerbate those issues. And I think it's important that we think about privilege, power imbalances, oppression, and justice, both in terms of, the harms that are being created, but also in how that thinks about how we think about, I suppose, eco-anxiety and those experiences people might have. So a solution isn't a solution if it only benefits certain people or is only accessible to certain people. And I think also, in how we can experience those emotions. So I think first of all, it's how we treat the problem, how we talk about socio-ecological crises, and who's being included in these conversations, who's actually like not just present, not tokenistically, but is actually being given the voice and opportunity to contribute and share their knowledge, are these people who are actually experiencing it, who are dealing with the direct impacts on their lives and livelihoods, and actually who often have incredible knowledge and experience. Are we honoring that and respecting that and their way of life, not imposing power and this kind of saving people thing of Western or rich governments? And I think it's also really important in how we experience things. Like for me, living in the UK, I've got this privilege of the space, the resource removed from those worst impacts. But actually, if you're on the front line of climate change, if you're facing that immediate threat to your survival, you don't have any choice but to keep going with those feelings. And I think it also perpetuates this sense of guilt that, do I even have the right to feel this way? when I have the luxury of that separation, where I'm not facing that threat to life directly, but I'm experiencing it secondhand from others. And I think, it can be, eco-anxiety can be thought of as something that is being experienced by these privileged Western white middle class Gen Zers, but that's often just who gets the spotlight. And I think if we ignore questions of privilege and power, we're ignoring the fact that, these issues of racial injustice, of oppression, gender violence, people have been tackling and dealing with these issues throughout the world, throughout time. And that's been something that's been part of their existence of these communities and their resilience and skills for so long. Mm-hmm. And we need to honor that. And actually, just because it might be the first time some people, because of their privilege, are experiencing this threat of an unlivable reality, it's not the first time for many communities, and I think we need to honor that.
Definitely. Thank you, Morag. We're going to now move on to Parker, just because I'm just looking at the time.
Sorry,
Don't worry. No, it's really important. And so do not worry. And if people have questions, we should have some time at the end. So make sure to put them in the chat. Parker, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about whether you experiencing eco-anxiety yourself sort of led you to want to support and work with eco-anxious individuals or organizations, because I know that's part of the work you do now.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you, Ellie and Morag, for sharing. And yeah, it resonates a lot, and it's nice to not feel alone in this, because even working in the space, it can still feel like so many people just in day-to-day life still feel so disconnected in some ways from the climate crisis, and some people are just so focused on having to focus on just day-to-day survival things that it's nice. It is a privilege, like you're saying, Maura, to be able to take a step back and be with these things. And that's something I think that for me has kind of inspired me to want to work with people who are experiencing both eco-anxiety, but as you mentioned earlier, like kind of the full range of distress, emotions. I mean, I don't, sometimes it feels like there aren't words to talk about these things, that it's so existential and it's so large and it's so interconnected. But yeah, for me, part of wanting to work with people experiencing it was my own challenges of feeling all of these emotions of grief and anger and anxiety, and not really knowing what to do with it so much. And also knowing like there's so many ways to take collective action, and a lot of the solutions I saw being offered was around organizing in collective action, which is so important. And my experience, I actually got into mental health before I got involved in like the climate movement, so they kind of merged a bit a couple years down the road. But a big part of that was seeing that collective action and organizing in solutions focused kind of suggestions are really helpful. And there's times, especially when like eco-anxiety or distress is intersecting with other mental health challenges, particularly things that are causing like a significant impact to like our social functioning, our relationships, like school, work. And for me, it's like I really wanted to offer a space for people to be able to talk about those things, and to also bring things like eco-anxiety, which is like a completely rational response to like irrational circumstances that we're all facing, like bringing that and normalizing it in therapy without stigmatizing it or pathologizing it or acting like there's something wrong, and saying at the same time, like, I need some one-on-one help with this. I need someone I can talk to and confide in, and I need that in addition to the collective work that I'm doing. So I think for me, it's like there's so many ways to be with this, and I think I've tried to kind of figure out what feels like my offering I want to do, and to try to find some peace, and like we're all part of this larger collective, which is nice to hear you all talking about this, because it reminds me of the bigger picture.
Thank you, Parker. I think it's amazing the work that you do. And I also just wanted to know a little bit about, I think, some of your practice. You integrate engaged Buddhist practice into your climate aware psychotherapy. Don't know why I couldn't say that today. I was wondering where that sort of came from. Did you have an experience where you were like, I want to start integrating this into my psychotherapy? And yeah, what sort of things you've learned from it and how you've maybe integrated it into your own life?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I would say encountering engaged Buddhist practice, and particularly like maybe some folks will be aware of like the Plum Village community in Thich Nhat Hanh, who they feel like have become kind of a de facto spiritual home for a lot of people in the climate space because um, he was he was a Zen like Buddhist monk from Vietnam who was exiled from Vietnam to France for calling for peace during the American War in Vietnam. And he's also one of the first kind of spiritual leaders to really, at least in the Western world, to speak very openly about the climate crisis and both the social and ecological components of it. So I actually encountered the Plum Village community in France before I was really aware of the climate crisis in a deep way, and also before I got into mental health. So in some ways, the engaged Buddhist practice was like feels like my kind of gateway or welcoming into this whole space. And for me, I feel extremely grateful to have encountered that first because I feel like having this both the community, which is a huge part of it, but also just this kind of spirituality or the sense of feeling connected to something larger than myself. And something I think we've all touched on a lot tonight, especially with the natural world, of feeling like this. Thich Nhat Hanh talks a lot about interbeing, this idea that like everything is interconnected. And so both hearing those teachings really resonate, but it also like I've been very privileged to farm and live there for some time. And I just left last month after living there for a year and a half. So I felt like I had the privilege of living with the community integrated with monastics, with people from all over the world, with a lot of amazing climate activists. To like more see from the eyes, they say, like of interbeing, and to see how connected everything is. And it's something that I've also felt more kind of solace in myself, but something I've worked with clients to offer. Maybe I'll share two kind of things that really resonate. One is this, they're both water metaphors, so we'll go with it. One is this idea that sometimes like using the metaphor, imagine if we had like a glass of water and we put like a tablespoon of salt in it, the water would be like too salty to drink. But if we take the same tablespoon of salt and put it into a river, there's no problem. We can still drink the water. And so this idea of the salt being the climate crisis, the reality we're facing, our individual suffering, we can't change the amount of salt that we have, but we can change the container within which we experience the suffering. So it's about like, how do we find a larger kind of sense of spaciousness inside and also collectively, like inside ourselves and in our communities, to experience the inevitable suffering that's present. And the other river metaphor that I really resonated with is this idea that in terms of taking collective action or where we engage with that change and healing and climate justice and ecological justice is like a river that's flowing in one direction, and it really doesn't matter where we step into it, like where on the bank we step in, we're all going in the same direction. So rather than trying to focus too much on like the perfect location, it's more like, how do we ease into the water and how do we stay in the water and keep flowing and trusting that everyone is gonna find their own way.
Thank you, Parker. I think those water metaphors were beautiful. And I think it's sometimes a nice way to talk about something so intangible in a bit more of like you can imagine it slightly more easily when using metaphors and things like that. Just to finish the panel, I wanted to sort of ask you all one last question. And this obviously is very unique and dependent on what helps you. But I wanted to know what, if you had any immediate or more practical steps that have helped you with your eco-anxiety and could potentially help others with their eco-anxiety. And I think we'll go back to Ellie first.
Yeah, I guess I can only really speak from what I've been through. For me, it's from reminding myself that I'm part of something bigger. And for the first time in my 19 laps around the sun, that I'm not alone in feeling this way. You know, my mates do too. And whether that's reconnecting with nature or being a part of a collective like reaction, it's really grounding to realize that you don't need to carry those burdens alone. Like daily, I find it really helpful to carve out time to appreciate the everyday casual magic, and that could literally be anything. And being part of a community also reminds me that we're in this together, and that collective action of any shape or size can make ripples of change. And I think it's also really important to remind yourself that it's okay to feel everything all at once, the anger, the frustration, the sadness, but don't carry it alone. The eco anxiety doesn't go away just because you're active in the movement. It's about managing it in ways that don't lead to burnout. And also for me, it's storytelling. The power of stories is undeniable, and it's in our DNA. It's our evolution. But if we can tell stories of wonder and magic, to copy Morag on that one, we will then create a world that we want to live in, and one that we can make together. And you don't have to save the world on your own. No one can. So start in your own corner of the world and let that be enough. Muck about, play with what's possible, acknowledge that even small, consistent actions matter. Find your crew. That's been the best part of my journey so far. And whether that's through activism or just chatting to like-minded people, that shared purpose definitely makes the load a lot lighter.
Thank you so much, Ellie. I think those are some amazing pieces of advice. Morag?
Thanks.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah, I love the use of that word play, of actually connecting with what you love and enjoy. So I guess finding ways to, maybe you have reminders or write things down, or you express it via art, journalism, photography. Like Parker said, it's really difficult to sometimes find how you can talk about these things, and it often feels very, I don't know, you can't, if you don't have that community of people, if you're struggling to find that, of people who maybe also experience these things, or somehow get it more, it can feel very isolating. So I think sometimes we just need to get it out. So writing, speaking, or however, dance, however you express it, I think that's so important. And I think also, if we actually maybe think about when we see something or hear something that makes us feel that incredible pain and suffering, maybe it's something in the news, or maybe it's something we're just feeling particularly aware of, to take a step back and think about, well, who's contributed to actually making this, drawing attention to this? Who's actually doing something about it? Because it will probably be a lot more than you think. So you can be grateful. I'm not saying it's not saying make yourself feel grateful, but sometimes it can be helpful to appreciate actually how much work's gone into making something better, or just seeing it, validating it. And another practical thing that's helped me is doing a loving kindness meditation to help that feeling of connection. So I definitely recommend that. And I don't know if anyone knows about climate Venn diagram concept by Dr. Jana Elizabeth Johnson. So thinking about the intersection of what you love and care about, what your skills are, and what the world needs. That's a really powerful way it's helped me.
Thank you so much, Morag. I haven't actually heard about those Venn diagrams, so I'm going to look into that after this. And Parker, to finish?
Yeah, you all said so much. It all really resonated. And maybe just a couple last small things. For me, I really love the climate cafe kind of model that's modeled off after the Death Cafe. And I think in the UK, it's definitely probably there's probably the most available there. It seems quite yeah, and if there's not one where you are in your town or uni or city, starting one is quite easy. And I think just having those, like like the webinars are great, and like psychotherapy is great, and retreats are great, but just having like unstructured space with people who maybe you don't even know yet, but there's this kind of solidarity and this mutual awareness of each other's suffering. I find those spaces always tend to like work their magic. And it's one of those things, like the more I'm finding, the more I felt a lot of shame around some of the despair and anxiety I felt. But I'm finding the more I'm able to share it, the more it doesn't go away, but there's a lightness to it because it's shared and validated, and speaking the truth of it, I feel like makes it easier to bear. And then the last thing is something I've been trying to do a lot with feeling despair, has been like trying to find like glimmers of ways of being, or of like communities or organizations that are just doing something differently, and without in my mind having to think about how they could scale or how I can replicate or how we can use this as like this big solution, to just put myself in those spaces somatically. Like here there's a climate justice circus that's going on this weekend with climate justice orgs, and made these like big cardboard puppets, and like there's all these kids singing and dancing, and like just to somatically be in that space with people I know who share similar concerns, but are choosing still to feel joy and to have solidarity. Like that's been my mindfulness practice, is just to be in those spaces and not have to think beyond that right now, and trust that there's something's happening, some seeds are being watered by being in those spaces.
Thank you so much, Parker. Another like very interesting points that you've made, and definitely climate cafes. There are a lot more in the UK that I've seen like cropping up in different cities. So definitely something to check out. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions, but if while we're waiting for any and to let the webinar finish, I thought I'd just say that we have put in some documents into the chat with various different links to like sort of different resources where you can find support if you're struggling with your mental health. So please definitely check them out. Our amazing speakers helped us a lot with them. So very grateful. We also made a feedback form for this webinar because we're hoping to, UK Youth for Nature is hoping to put on more of these. So if you've attended and have some time, it'd be amazing if you could fill that out. I was just waiting if there were any questions, but this is quite a big topic, and I think a lot of the time, sometimes you need to take time after talking about something like this to just digest all the information. And I just hope that today's webinar, everyone has found it insightful, or at least it's just made you think a bit about it and maybe made you feel a little bit more comforted. So yeah, I think I'll thank the speakers now, who have been amazing. So thank you to Morag, Parker and Ellie for joining. It's been a pleasure speaking with you all. And yeah, I just thank you again to everyone who joined us this evening. And I think we'll say goodbye now. I know we're finishing a little bit early, but yeah, thank you so much, and hope everyone has a wonderful evening.